Now I will discuss the friction here. Let us consider the friction. First I will discuss what is friction here. Before discussing the friction, we need to recall Newton's first law. As per the Newton's first law, a body remains in rest if we don't apply any external force that will not come to motion. If a body is in motion, to come to rest, we need to apply some external force. This is what the Newton's first law, we know that to change the state of the body, we need some external force. So from this point, let us consider one case here. On a table, I kept an object. Assume that an object is there on the table like this, so that I am applying a small force like this. A small force applied on this object. Assume a small force applied on this object. There is no movement of this object, so that acceleration is 0. Even if I apply small force here, this object is not coming into motion. Acceleration is 0. That means relative motion also 0 between these two objects. In case if I apply a large force on this object like this, then applying large force, it causes motion of this object with some acceleration a non-zero acceleration we can observe, so that this body is in motion and relative motion is not equal to 0 and acceleration is not equal to 0. In this case, where a sufficient large force applied on this object that leads to the relative motion and with non-zero acceleration. So first we have to observe here what happened to this small force. As per the Newton's law, if some external force is applied, body should come into motion. But here in the first case, even if we apply some small force, this object is not coming into motion. Then what about this force? So there should be some compensating force. In the reverse direction, you can observe, in the reverse direction there should be some compensating force, so that this F small is compensated with this force, which should be acting in the opposite direction. So this force is called friction force here. So what is the nature of this friction force? If you observe, this is always acting opposite direction to the applied force. Here this is the applied force, and the compensating force which stops the object from motion, then that force is taken as a friction force here. Simply the friction is, it is an electromagnetic force due to the intermolecular forces between the two surfaces of objects which are in contact, and that opposes the relative motion between these two objects. So this is what the friction definition we have. So this friction, if you observe, what are the causes for this friction? If you see the causes for the friction, we can consider that first it is intermolecular forces. The intermolecular forces is the primary reason for the frictional force. Similarly, surface irregularities. Surface irregularities is also the reason for the frictional force. Generally, if you see here the object surface, it may looks like smooth, but every object surface should have some irregularities in the surface. Even if it looks like smooth, but definitely at micro level we can observe some irregularities on the surfaces. Because of this surface irregularities, we can observe interlock between this surface irregularities, even though some small force is applied, that stops this object coming into relative motion. So because of this frictional force, that is the cause we can observe here. Fine. Similarly, if you can observe advantages of this friction, the first advantage is walking on the floor is possible because of friction only. We are walking on the floor without sliding because of friction. So we can take advantages or walking. Similarly, a vehicle to come into rest, we apply brakes. Brakes are acting based on the friction. So brakes are considering that an advantage to stop the vehicles to come into rest. Similarly, I am holding this pen because of friction between my finger and pen. So to hold the pen we need friction between the pen and fingers. Similarly, writing on this board also we need some friction between this pen and board. These two surfaces should have some friction to write it properly. So writing is possible only because of friction, and so on. Similarly, if you observe some disadvantages of friction. So because of friction between the internal parts of the machinery, some extra mechanical energy is needed to operate properly. So we consider that extra mechanical energy needed. And there is some power loss in the internal components because of this friction. This power loss leading to loss of the efficiency. If you observe, efficiency will decrease because of this friction. I'll write here. Efficiency is decreasing because of friction due to power loss here. And if you observe, unnecessary heat will be produced because of friction in the machinery. Sometimes that may damage the machinery. So that heat produced is also a disadvantage. And we can consider lifetime of the machinery also decreases because of this friction only. Lifetime decreases here. These are some disadvantages we can consider because of friction here. And if you want to change the friction between two objects, what we can do if you observe? How to change the friction? How to change the friction if you observe? We can change the friction by polishing the surfaces. So first we can consider polishing decreases the friction here, but up to some extent only. If you polish the surface, obviously friction will decrease, but up to some extent only. After that extent, what happens means, after becoming more smooth of the surfaces, molecules will become closer and they increase the intermolecular forces. If intermolecular forces are increasing, we know that if intermolecular force increasing, obviously the friction force will be increasing. So up to some extent only polishing can decrease the friction, we can say. So polishing is one reason to change the friction, and by using some lubricants, by applying some oil between the two surfaces, the friction can be decreased here. Similarly, streamlining. So some automobiles, they are designed with some curved surfaces to decrease the friction here. That is called streamlining. That decreases that changes the friction or decreases the friction. And we can observe that by selecting the proper material also we can decrease the friction here, by selection of proper material. Now let us see what is friction and what are different types of frictions.